Bob Hendershot, and I'm a history professor at the Grand Rapids Community College. And welcome to Diversity Conversations. It's my pleasure to be here today with Julissa Arce, the author of My Underground American Dream, a new book that came out in 2016. And she is our guest at campus this week, and tonight she's giving a presentation at our Diversity Lecture Series. And we're very pleased to have her here with us today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Tonight she'll be speaking about the American dreamer, from undocumented to Wall Street to immigration advocacy. And I've had the opportunity to read your book, and it brought so many different issues to the foreground, and I have many things that I want to ask you, but I thought that I would begin by just asking you, what would you say, with all the things going on in your work here, what is the main argument of your book? And what made you want to share your story, a very personal story, in this way?
Yeah. Well, I'll start with answering that second question about what sort of led me to share this very personal story, which is that I realized when I was 27 years old that I had everything that most people could want, right? I had a really amazing career. I made a ton of money. I was 27 years old. And I had a boyfriend that could dance. I mean, I had everything. And I realized that I also had a lot of privilege, despite having been undocumented for a long time. I had resources. I was now on my way to becoming an American citizen because my college boyfriend who I married is a U.S. citizen, and that's how I was able to adjust my status. And I realized that I had a big responsibility in sharing my story to shift the conversation around what people think of undocumented immigrants specifically. There's a lot of, I think, misconceptions about why undocumented immigrants come to the country. There's a lot of misconceptions about who we are, and I think a lot of times we become this really like mythical figures that you watch on television, and there isn't enough personal stories being told that frame the conversation. And so the point of the book really is to hopefully humanize the issue of immigration and realize that when we talk about immigrants, we're talking about people who are really no different than anyone else. People who have dreams and ambitions and aspirations, and who, for the most part, really just want to provide for their families and live their life in peace. And that's what I hope people get out of the book, that I'm just a normal person who has lived a really interesting life with a lot of ups and downs, and who, despite facing many challenges, I think you've read the book, I think you also get this sense of I had a lot of hope, and I was a happy person. And at the end of the day, I was just a human.
Yeah. Well, one of the themes of your work is the idea of the American dream. In my history classes, for example, we often talk about issues of identity construction and nationalism in the United States. The concept of the American dream is so integral to American identity. And, when did you first become aware of the concept of the American dream?
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, I knew about the American dream before I even came to live here, right? Because my parents started working in the U.S. when I was just 3 years old. So from the time I was 3 to the time I was 11, I lived in Mexico, and my parents, for the most part, lived in the U.S. And they would go back and forth between Mexico and the U.S. They had a business importing sterling silver from Tasco, which is where I'm from in Mexico. And I missed my parents a lot. And what they would always tell me is that a lot more was possible in the U.S., right? And so I started learning about this American dream long before I came to live here. And when I did come to live here, my mom always told me that you had to do two things to achieve the American dream. You had to work hard, and you had to stay out of trouble. And if you did those two things, you could achieve anything in this country. I think that, I loved math, and this formula made sense to me until I became undocumented. And then it was this extra factor that just didn't fit in that formula, right? Because I worked hard, I stayed out of trouble, and a lot of people work hard and they stay out of trouble, and still whatever they perceive to be the American dream is not achievable to them. I had a hard time when I first came here viewing myself as American. And I'll tell you why. When I was growing up in Mexico, I used to watch a few American television shows that were dubbed in Spanish. Cartoons like Dennis the Menace and television series like Beverly Hills 90210. And in all of these shows that I watched, everyone that was referred to as American was beautiful, rich, and white. So I never saw anyone on television before I came to live here be called an American who wasn't white. So I had this idea that to be American, you had to look a certain way and you had to have a certain economic status.
Yeah.
Right? And of course, all of that began changing when I moved to San Antonio, where there's lots of people that look like me. And there's probably more Mexican restaurants than there are McDonald's in Texas. And so what I started to realize is that this concept of American culture is really, there's really more than meets the eye. Because in Texas, American culture is very different than what I have found to be American culture in California, where I now live, or in New York, where I lived for 10 years. And each place in the United States has a certain flavor of American culture that's influenced by the people who were there long before we got here, right? And so I've sort of, now I view myself as American, right? And a lot of people always say, like, well, if you really want to be American, then, you can't, like, be Mexican anymore. And I just think that's kind of silly, because if you asked a kid, who do you love more, your mom or your dad? I kind of feel like that's what people are asking me to do, to choose between my mom and my dad. And I'm always going to be Mexican because that's my culture and I was born there. And we have this amazing traditions that I don't ever want to give up. And at the same time, I've lived in the United States since I was 11 years old. I've lived here for 23 years, and I am American. And I don't have to look a certain way, and I don't have to have a specific amount of money in my bank account. And I don't have, I can be all of these things and still be American.
Yes. Yeah. And so as your identity became American and you embraced the idea of being American, in the years after your arrival, you were 11 years old when you came. And then the tourist visa that brought you to the United States expired when you were still just a kid, right, 14. And so how did that impact your identity, right? Did that even register, right, as a very young person, what that meant for your life or your future career?
Yeah. Well, the day that I found out that I was undocumented, and I tell this story in the book, I was bugging my mom about, when are we going to go to Mexico to have my quinceañera? I always tell people, if you don't know what a quinceañera is, picture a wedding without the groom, or without the bride, and like that's a quinceañera. It's that big, and I really wanted to celebrate this rite of passage in Mexican culture, and my mom just told me that I couldn't go to Mexico anymore because if I went to Mexico, I wouldn't be able to come back because our visas had expired. And frankly, that night when she told me that, I cried about not having a party. I didn't cry about I'm undocumented, because when you're 14 years old, you don't know what undocumented really means even, right? Or what the consequences of that could be. So it wasn't really until I was applying to college that I realized being undocumented makes me different. And being undocumented comes with it come many challenges that I would otherwise not have to face. But what I will say about identity and how did my identity change, it was really difficult to know that I was undocumented and to see and hear how undocumented people were referred to, right? So undocumented is this sort of new word that we've started using recently, unauthorized, undocumented. But before that, when I was growing up, the words that were used were illegal. We still use that word today. Illegal alien, right? And I never thought of myself as an alien, right? Like, I was learning English and I was like, I think aliens are these like green things from Mars. I mean, my skin's different, but like I look, human.
Right. But this is not merely semantics.
It's
This
not.
is a very important distinction because the words that we use to debate important legal issues and politics, they really matter.
They do.
And you get into that
Yeah.
quite a bit. And I was going to ask you, calling someone illegal alien versus undocumented person. I mean, there's a world of difference there, but you might like to say a little bit more about
Yeah.
that. We need to change the conversation,
Yeah.
yes?
Yep. And you're absolutely right that the words that we use very much shape a conversation, right? And if you look at sort of other social justice type of issues and you see the evolution of the language that's been used, you can very much see how the conversations begins to change. Right? And when it comes to immigration, calling someone an alien, you're sort of automatically putting them and labeling them as an outsider, as something that doesn't belong, right? When we talk about illegal, and it's interesting to me that the argument for using the word illegal is that someone broke the law. Right? You broke the law, therefore you're illegal. Yeah. But we don't use that word illegal to refer to anybody else that has broken the law. Even someone who's a murderer, we don't call them illegal. Mm-hmm. We don't call someone who stole something. We don't when you go above the speed limit and you've broken the law, we don't label you illegal. We only use this word illegal when it comes to immigrants. Yeah. And that's very deliberate why we do that. Because as soon as we start calling someone an alien, an illegal alien, we take away their humanity. Yeah. And we begin to view them as something other than a person with human emotions, right? And it makes it easier for us to have different types of conversations about them because they're illegal. Yeah. They're illegal, therefore they don't have any rights, they don't have any voice, they don't deserve our compassion because there's something else, they're illegal. Right? When we begin to call people undocumented is simply a word that refers to my immigration status, not to me as a human being, as a person. Sure. I'm not, my immigration status was that of someone who's undocumented because I didn't have documents. I wasn't authorized to be in the country. But my immigration status shouldn't define the entirety of who I am because there's so much more to me than my immigration status.
Absolutely. The term alien is intentionally dehumanizing. And undocumented person, right? That noun is person, right? You retain the humanity of the individual. Right. So just by changing the language that we use, we can add more humanity, hopefully more empathy to our national conversation about the law and about immigration and about the relationship between nations. Yeah. Yeah. You spent a lot of your life in a place between two identities, or attempting to reconcile two different levels of identity. You were an American in every social or cultural, sense of the term, but you were also simultaneously an undocumented person. And what are the greatest struggles for someone in that situation? And I think, even more than that, as your situation is hardly unique to yourself, what advice would you give to others who live in a similar situation with those two identities simultaneously?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was always I have all of my life straddled between two different places, two different cultures, two different identities, right? Even working on Wall Street, right? I worked on Wall Street, and I was undocumented when I worked there. And it was always so interesting to me how I had resources that a lot of Americans, even though they were born here, don't have. And at the same time, I couldn't do things as simple as going to a bar and having a drink with my colleagues because I didn't have a driver's license. I didn't have an ID with my name and my age on it. And so things that we take for granted, that we just do as part of everyday life, like going to get a drink or driving from one place to another or boarding a plane, right? I had a Mexican passport that didn't have a visa on it. And presumably, anytime I boarded a plane, if somebody turned to the visa part of it and I didn't have a visa, something could have happened to me. Right? And so I always had to struggle between reconciling the sort of socioeconomic status that I had worked my way into, and at the same time, I was always so conscious of the fact that my immigration status dictated so much of what my everyday life could look like. Right? And so I encourage people who are undocumented to not let that aspect of their life dictate everything else that they do, and how they view themselves, and to not let anybody else make you feel like you're less than because you don't have a U.S. passport, because that doesn't make you any less valuable as a human being.
Yes, yeah. And yet you also wrote in the book about that, I'll quote you if I may.
Yeah.
What we have in the United States is essentially a caste system for undocumented immigrants. And when I read those words, I had to put the book down and think for a moment, because the concept of a society as rigidly hierarchical as the caste systems of past ages doesn't really seem compatible with my identity as an American or a member of American society. But I think that you definitely have a point there. Right, and with the difficulties of becoming a citizenship and the legal jungle that one must negotiate to try to adjust their status, and then with the detention centers in this country today, and I think, wow, if we do indeed have an operating caste system in the United States of America, then the idea of the American dream is then little more than romantic national mythology. And so, how do we negotiate that?
Yeah.
As a society, what do we do if we have a caste system for undocumented people? And we still have this national identity based around the concept that anyone can be anything.
Right.
How do we go from here?
Yeah.
What do we do?
Yeah. So the reason I call it a caste system, right? If you just look at the very basic definition of a caste system, is that the level where you are born into, that's the level where you die. Right? Like, very simple. Like, where you were born is where you stay. No matter what you do, you still stay there.
No matter how hard you work.
No matter how hard you work, right? And that's what I mean by a caste system around the immigration system. Because when you're an undocumented immigrant, it doesn't matter how hard you work. It doesn't matter how much out of trouble you stay. It doesn't matter how much you follow the rules. There is nothing that you can do to change your status, right? And that brings in this other thing that you didn't ask me about, but I'm gonna talk about anyways.
Please.
Which is this concept that undocumented people stay undocumented because they want to. A question I very often get is, when I say I was undocumented for over a decade, people are like, "But why? Like, how come you didn't apply sooner? Why didn't you fill out the application?" And
There's
so I have to.
an awful lot of privilege involved in that, just asking that question in the first place.
And so I have to, I have to take a step back and walk people through why. Like, why don't you apply? Yes. Which is that the very simple answer is that there isn't an application to fill out for undocumented people, because there are very few ways in which someone can become a permanent resident and eventually a citizen. One of the ways is if your parents are American citizens. Well, both of my parents were Mexican citizens. If you marry a U.S. citizen, which is eventually how I was able to fix my status, but even then, there's a lot of details, right? That if you cross the border illegally, even if you marry a U.S. citizen, it's not very likely that you're going to be able to adjust your status without leaving the country. And as soon as you leave the country, you get hit with what's called a 10-year ban. Means you can't come back for 10 years. 10 years. Okay? Or if you have a very highly specialized job, like an engineer, a very specific type of engineer, or if you're a translator for a very obscure language that our government needs someone to translate. And that's pretty much, there's also U visas. So if you were a victim of a crime. But outside of those ways, there isn't another way. There isn't an application you can fill out, which is why a lot of people do come into the country illegally. That's why a lot of people find themselves here with expired visas and then become undocumented, because there is no easy way to become documented, to become an American citizen. And so that's what I mean by we keep this entire group of people where they are, and we don't give them any options for getting out of that situation, but then we blame them and we criminalize them for staying where they are. We say we make them feel ashamed for being undocumented. And if they go out and they buy fake papers to be able to work and provide for the families, that's a crime, right? If somebody gets pulled over and they don't have a driver's license, they get sent to jail. We equate the word criminal with the word undocumented, and we use them interchangeably. And at the same time, we don't give any avenue for these people to get out of that situation. That's a caste system.
Yeah. And criminalizing immigration or in immigrants, I'm sad to say, is currently in vogue. With the rise of Donald Trump, anti-immigrant sentiment has reached levels not seen in this country for decades. And anger against illegal immigration, which was previously confined to the fringe of the Republican base, is now often at the center of dialogue. And much of the American right continues to score or to attempt to score points with their potential voters by criminalizing immigrants.
Yeah.
And why is that? Why has the debate and discourse of American politics changed in such a pronounced way in recent years?
Yeah. You know what I think it's interesting is that anti-immigrant sentiment was not invented in the last election. And there's a lot more attention to it. There are a lot more cameras on it, but it's not something that's new. And as someone who was undocumented for a long time, who grew up undocumented, I can tell you firsthand that the things we hear about now are things I heard about 20 years ago. And what's interesting is, I watch videos of Bill Clinton give speeches where he is calling undocumented people illegals and aliens, and we must stop the illegal ins, and that's from a Democratic precedent, right? Yeah. So it really is, to me, this isn't a Republican Democrat issue. To me, it's really an overall American issue that we must confront and we must talk about. But I don't sit here and blame Republicans. I don't sit here and blame Donald Trump supporters for what's happening, because a lot of this has sort of been boiling for a long time and is just now coming to the surface. And it is coming to the surface in a much uglier way than it ever has been before. But I'll give you an example. In Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, laws have been passed that make it a crime for undocumented students to enroll in higher education. Think about that. It's illegal for a student who wants to pursue higher education to enroll in a public university. It makes it a crime. So if you go and you try to enroll in a school and you get caught trying to enroll in a state school at those states, you've now committed a crime, right? Those laws were passed years ago. Right? They weren't passed in the last year. So this kind of stuff is happening and has been happening all over the country. I am glad, though, that now we are focusing in on it much more, and we're trying to understand, like, why are these things happening, right? Yeah. And I think that if we're honest with ourselves, there's been people on the left and people on the right who, for much longer than the last year, have had these sentiments about immigrants. And if we go, way back, I don't have to tell you this as a history professor, there's always been this fear for the new wave of immigrants, right? Whether it was the Irish or the Italians, there's always been this sort of anti-immigrant sentiment. And you would think that we would learn from history that, hey, when there are new waves of people coming into the country doesn't end. Like, it doesn't... I don't know if I'm allowed to use this word, so I won't say it. But the country doesn't, go to the bottom of the barrel. Like it's okay. When people who come in who look different than us, who speak different languages than us, who bring different customs than us, it's okay.
Mm-hmm. The sky will not fall.
Actually, exactly, the sky has never fallen because immigrants have come into the country.
Yes.
Actually, immigrants make it better.
Yeah, there's been a historical ebb and flow, right, to positive and negative sentiment over immigration. But in the last few years, I mean, we have seen crowds of thousands chanting "Build the Wall." And so I'm thinking, you're an immigration rights advocate, and that must be a very challenging field, and an important field of work to pursue. In your book, I think you were very eloquent when you wrote about how the law and the concept of justice are not always synonymous. And in your view, just my last question, in your view, what would it take to make United States immigration laws more just?
Yep, it is true that the law and justice have never been the same, and I have often found that the laws are always trying to catch up to what's just. Right? We've passed a series of laws in the history of our country that now we look back on them and we're ashamed of them. Right? When I think about not that long ago, in not my lifetime, because I'm young, but in people's lifetimes in this country, it was illegal to marry someone of a different race, right? And we had to pass laws to correct that injustice, right? And today we find ourselves in sort of a whole new set of laws that are really unjust to people who come here and who want to give of their talents to make this country better and who just want to provide for their family. So I think that if we looked at the immigration system as I think we should, which is a benefit, a positive thing for the country, then the laws would be much better because we would be framing those laws from that lens of immigration is a good thing for the country. When we attack immigration policy from the lens of how can we keep immigration low, how can we get rid of these criminals, well, then we're already starting from a position of a bad position in my view, right? We're already starting a negative position. Mind, exactly. So when we talk about, well, what do we do with 11 million people who are here undocumented? The average amount of years that an undocumented person has lived in the country is 10 years. That's the average. So people have built lives here. We can't just talk about kicking them out. And also, when we talk about the wall, you mentioned the chance of the wall. I came here on a plane. So how high does this wall have to be?
Yes.
Right?
I mean, the wall is stupid. It's not going to solve any of these problems. It doesn't solve anything. Yeah.
And you know what, by the way, like I get I think sometimes pushback because I realize that there are things at the border that are real concerns, right? Drugs do try to come in through the border. There is human trafficking that happens at the border. And if we actually try to stop those bad things from happening versus casting this super wide net and, again, criminalizing people who just want to work, we would be much more effective at keeping the country safe.
Yes.
But many times when we talk about build the wall and ICE, we're ramping up the number of deportations. We're deporting people who don't even have criminal records instead of really focusing on people who are trying to do harm. And there are those people. Those people, I think, are far and few in between. And when we cast a really wide net, we actually miss those people, and we don't have effective solutions. So I think the way we approach this is we have to have really serious conversations and honest conversations that don't come from the standpoint of immigrants are bad. Yeah.
First, we change the nature of the conversation, the terminology we use. We start to change, thinking on these important issues, and we go from there.
Yeah.
Julissa, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
It's been a great pleasure to sit and chat with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.